As a child, we all remember reading storybooks and imagining the pages coming to life, whether that were the classics like The Kissing Hand or Goodnight Moon. However, stories aren't only told in books, but through experiences of others. It can even be through a picture or a painting. Most everything we say and do is a story. Today, we will be taking you back in time through a new story, discussing narrative paradigm theory. So come along, little caterpillar. Adventure awaits. Hello, young caterpillar. My name is Elise. I will be taking you through what narrative paradigm means and is. Narrative paradigm is a common interpretive lens used by people to determine if a story is true or not. It is also built off of 5 assumptions. The first is that people are essentially storytellers. Second, we make decisions on the basis of good reasons. 3, history, biography, culture, and character determine what we consider good reasons. 4, narrative rationality is determined by the coherence and fidelity of our stories. And the final one is that the world is a set of stories from which we choose, and this constantly recreates our lives. Let's break down what narrative paradigm is. Narration is symbolic actions like words that have sequence and meaning for those who live or interpret them. Essentially, all communication is a narrative except for jokes, and every communication is already embedded in an ongoing story with a beginning, middle, and end. There are also multiple types of narratives, and these can be factual narratives or fictional narratives. Factual narratives, these represent events or experiences that have happened in the real world. We can prove these based off facts and verify these events and create a story that aligns with reality, probably making these more reliable. And fictional narratives, these are not rooted in facts or events, but they're still able to convey a meaningful message and lesson. And we can see this through myths, movies, cartoons, whatever grabs the audience's attention and influences them. These tend to be more imagined or dramatized events.
Hello, little caterpillar. My name is Elizabeth. What are some key elements of this theory? Well, little caterpillar, before I tell you some key elements of this theory, how about I tell you who proposed it? Walter Fisher. Walter Fisher actually proposed this theory. One of his big suggestions was that human beings are natural storytellers, and that a good story is more convincing than a good argument. He also claimed that humans are better able to understand and communicate through storytelling, and that all meaningful communication occurs through these narratives, and that stories are more persuasive than logical arguments. But in order for these stories to be more persuasive than a logical argument, you need to have 2 very important qualities. These are heavily emphasized, so listen closely. You need to have the narrative coherence and the narrative fidelity, which you will hear about and learn about later on in the story. So keep an ear out and listen closely. In order to make these narratives work well with the audience, you need to have different elements that go into the structure of the narratives. Lots of elements, I understand, but they are all necessary to make this narrative and this theory plausible and successful. So, for the structure of the narratives, you're going to need the plot, the characters, the setting, and the conflict. Without all of these elements, your story or narrative is going to fail, so you won't be able to go through this theory correctly. For the plot, we're going to need a sequence of events that make up the story, the beginning, the middle, and the end, as well as a cause and effect between the events. It's going to give you a frame of how the story is going to go, and it's going to help the audience better understand, which you will learn about again later on in the story. You're going to need characters. You're going to need people or entities involved in the narrative, their actions, the motivations, and the development throughout the story. These are going to be crucial parts in making your narrative work. They're the core. They're the center. They're the reason people continue to listen and understand. Your characters. Without strong characters, your narrative will fail. But you're also going to need a setting, because how are you going to know where this story takes place if you don't have a setting? But we're also going to need a conflict that pushes this story along and makes us want to root for our character in order for this narrative to be successful. Once again, in order to make your narrative successful, you're going to need a plot, characters, setting, conflict. These are all going to help engage the audience into your narrative, which once again, you will learn about later on in this story. There is also an opposite theory that relates to this one. An opposite? What is it? The opposite is the rational world paradigm. The rational world paradigm, in short, was when arguments were most persuasive when it was logical, when it was more evidence-based reasoning, and when it relied on knowledge and understanding. This was also reflected upon through the readings of Plato and Aristotle. The rational world paradigm also had 5 assumptions. 1, that people are essentially rational. 2, we make decisions on the basis of arguments. 3, the type of speaking situation determines the course of our argument. 4, rationality is determined by how much we know and how well we argue. And 5, the world is a set of logical puzzles that we can solve through rational analysis. Why are we learning about the rational world paradigm? Well, simply it's because the narrative paradigm assumptions as well were built off of each other. The narrative ones were built off of the rational world ones. They were very different in contents, but they still intertwine with one another. So if we are going to talk about one, it is very important that we go over the other. Once again, the rational world paradigm is a theory that assumes people are rational beings who make decisions based on logical arguments, evidence, and reasoning. They have rational decision-making skills, logical reasoning, and good reasons to approach. These are all very important, but we are going to get back to our own theory. And getting back to the theory, we are going to be talking about the 2 fundamental elements that make up the narrative paradigm.
My name is Emma. As we flip the page and move on to the next part of the story, we're going to be talking about the 2 types of narratives. Yes, little caterpillar, there are in fact 2, and the 2 are named rationality narrative and fidelity narrative. These 2 narratives are very different. One's going to be far more logistical, and the other is going to be far more emotional. But it's important that we have those 2 different ones because they each play a role in how people can assess and explain a story. Through the judgment in these categories, the audience is able to determine the quality of the story. So let's jump right into what makes these different narratives unique. Alrighty, so the rationality narrative. This one's going to deal a lot with the structure of the story. Things like the plot, the characters, setting, conflict, roles of the audience. All these different categories are going to be referred to in this evaluation. So, this refers again on how well the elements of the story fit together. Does the story make sense? Are the characters' actions, their sequences of events, or the relationships between each logistic of the story consistent? Are we able to see how the narrative holds together, or if it follows a consistent, logical plot? This style narrative evaluation fits for a lot of people who feel a little bit more rational. People who make decisions with scientific perspectives, are more argument basis or legislative basis. These type of brains are going to fit really well when it comes to evaluating these parts of the stories. The narrative fidelity is a little bit different. It's going to talk about the quality of the words being used. It's going to see how well the words strike a chord with the audience. And to explain it simply, little caterpillar, This examines how well stories resonate with the audience. Does the story ring true to the listener or reader? Does it reflect universal truths or values that the audience can relate to based off of their own life experiences? And a story with high fidelity is one that aligns with the listener's worldviews and experiences. Now, little caterpillar, I see that you are wondering how the audience is supposed to evaluate this quality. Yes, I gave you obviously the definitions of the narratives, but it's true. What does it look like for the audience to evaluate the different narratives? Well, I believe there is going to be three portions or three categories that help the reader or the audience evaluate the story. First category is going to be the logistics. It's going to relate a lot to the relatability, the rationality narrative. Sorry about that. It's going to talk about, does the narrative reflect the audience's logistics? Does the story tie together? Are the characters' actions believable? Are they consistent with the plot? Does the event in the story unfold in a way that is understandable or plausible? Right? Very basic things when coming to think about stories. The second category is going to be that relatability. Does the narrative reflect the audience's worldviews? Does it align or disagree with the personal experiences, cultural context, or moral values of the reader or the audience? Does it feel true or meaningful based on the listener's understanding of the world? And then that third category is going to talk about emotions. Does the narrative evoke empathy, sympathy, or even anger? Does the audience feel joyful? Are they sad? Or are they hopeful as the story unfolds? Or does the audience care about the character's fate and their struggles? Well, young caterpillar, I know that was a lot of information for you, but I hope that you learned a little bit more about how audiences evaluate the quality of a story and about the two different types of narratives that are involved in story making.
Hi, my name is Kayla. What are the 5 assumptions, you may ask? Well, I will explain each one of those to you. The first of the 5 assumptions is storytellers. This means that people are essentially natural storytellers. People tell stories to make other people see what they want them to see. People tell stories based off of their history, based off of who they are, and based off of what they think other people are like. The next assumption is good reasons. This means that we make decisions in life on the basis of good reasoning. We use any reason that we see as good based off of what stories we are told to make decisions and make stories that we see as good. The next of the 5 assumptions is that history, biography, culture, and character determine what we consider to be good reason. The good reasons that we talk about are all made up of who we are because of what we have been told, how we were raised, and what social structures we surround ourselves with. The 4th assumption out of the 5 is narrative rationality. Narrative rationality is determined by the coherence and fidelity of our stories. This means that when we are determining what our narrative is going to be or what our story is going to be, we understand that what we say is based off of who we are and what our stories are going to be. The next and last assumption of the 5 is that the world is a set of stories from which we choose, which constantly recreates our lives and others. This means, young caterpillar, that our world is set around stories from what we hear and who we are and what we say. Basically, all life is made up of the stories that we hear and the stories that we say based off of good reason, our history, and the fact that we are natural storytellers. Well, my young caterpillar,
Some criticisms include the values embedded in the message. This first criticism means that whatever message is being told, there are values that are already pre-embedded in that message based off of what the audience already feels about the topic. The next criticism is that the relevance of those values are how we make decisions. The third criticism is that the consequence of adhering to those values can alternate how we see a story. The fourth is that the overlap with the worldview of the audience can alter how we view a story. This overlap would use the worldview and change it to how the audience views the world and how we receive a message from a story. And the last of the criticism is that conformity with what audience members believe is an ideal basis for conduct can ultimately change or morph or shape how we view a story. All 5 of these criticisms include ways of how an audience can pre-perceive a message being told, which ultimately gives a overall criticism to the narrative paradigm theory. Yes, my dear butterfly, in conclusion, we can see that narratives shape human perceptions based off of our history and our biography, culture, and character. This all determines how we see stories and how we see the world. Our beliefs also shape how we perceive a story and how we tell a story. And lastly, our social interactions clearly explain how we would tell a story to another person, how we perceive a story from another person, and all the outside factors that go into how we understand the world as a whole. And this last page, Caterpillar, is our references and the narrative paradigm story where all of our information comes from.